the call. Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the third and final session of our two-day webinar. I'm Margaret O'Hara. I'm a founding trustee of Long COVID Support, and I'm also a research professional. I work in the NHS. I've had long COVID myself on and off for 3 years. I'm a repeat offender with long COVID, and I keep getting reinfected. I'm going to hand over to Helen Hughes, who is our co-chair, and ask her to introduce herself.
Hello, thanks, Margaret. My name's Helen Hughes. I'm Chief Executive of Charity Patient Safety Learning. Been working with Margaret and other colleagues at Long COVID Support and other long COVID groups, promoting the voice of people living with long COVID. I've probably had long COVID myself, but not diagnosed. But so I have a very personal perspective on that. And I'm delighted to continue doing our work in promoting the voice of people living with long COVID and kind of awareness raising, campaigning for more activity and research through our learning platform, the Hub, and in other ways. So delighted to be with you today.
So I just want to very briefly run through who's on the panel today, and then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in no more than 1 minute. And just to say, we've got a slight change to the panel. Dr. Athena Akrami unfortunately wasn't able to attend. And we have Professor Brendan Delaney, who's a GP and Professor of Medical Informatics and Decision Making at Imperial, joining instead. We've also got Dr. Ray Duncan, who's a Senior Consultant Cardiologist, Dr. Binita Kane, who's a Respiratory Consultant, Dr. Victoria Thomas, Head of Public Engagement at NICE, Dr. Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer at MHRA, and Nikki Smith, who is another founding member of Long COVID Support and is a forensic scientist by profession. So Nikki, could I ask you to kick off and just introduce yourself in 1 minute?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Nikki Smith, and I'm currently well into my 4th year of long COVID. I'm a founding member of Long COVID Support, with whom I mainly focus on research and health advocacy. And I also help to run our COVID-19 research involvement group on Facebook, which highlights research on COVID-19 and long COVID. Since having long COVID, I've helped co-design studies and have provided PPI on various aspects of long COVID research, including identifying priority research questions, long COVID care, symptoms, treatments, pathophysiology, and data analysis. And I've also co-authored papers on long COVID and the importance of patient involvement in research. In addition, I've worked with several organisations, including the NIHR and the World Health Organization, on long COVID matters. And finally, I'm also a community partner and currently on the management committee of the Social, Genetic and Environmental Determinants of Health theme with the NIHR Imperial Biomedical Research Centre.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm just going by the tile. So next I've got Brendan.
Hi, yes, Brendan Delaney. You've already partly introduced me. I suppose, to be fair, my main interest prior to COVID had been in diagnostic decision support, patient safety, artificial intelligence, and health services research. I'm a GP 1 day a week. I think long COVID found me. I had COVID in March 2020, and I really wasn't right for about 2 years afterwards. I think a lot less severely affected than many people, but enough to, I think, fire up my interest in really how to deal with this and what the causes are. So I'm co-chief investigator with Manoj Sivan with the locomotion study. And I think you've heard over the past couple of days several of our locomotion investigators, including Trish Greenhalgh and Joseph Kwan. Yeah, happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Next is Ray Duncan.
Hi there. My name's Ray Duncan. I'm just going to explain about my mask. I'm sitting at home, but my daughter's just tested positive for COVID, and we have an open plan house, so I hope you can hear me okay. I'm a consultant cardiologist and laterally a long COVID researcher and clinician at Newcastle University, at Newcastle Hospitals. I'm also an honorary senior lecturer at Newcastle University. I've been involved in long COVID, both from initially from a clinical perspective, running a post-COVID cardiovascular complications clinic from 2020. I'm now involved in the research. We've just received funding for a treatment trial, which we will hopefully be starting in the new year. We're hopefully about to receive funding for a second trial in children that we're working with long COVID kids with. I sit on the expert advisory team on long COVID for the World Health Network, and I am a medical champion for the Long COVID Kids charity, and I'm also part of the Long COVID International Research Collaboration, colloquially known as Team CLUTS.
Thanks, Ray. Next up, we've got Binita.
Hi, I'm Dr. Binita Kane. I'm a respiratory physician in Manchester, various touch points with long COVID like Ray. So I treat patients with long COVID in the NHS. I am leading some research both in adults and children on pathophysiology. I also sit on the World Health Network advisory group, and I'm a champion for the Long COVID Kids charity.
Thanks very much. Next, we've got Dr. Alison Cave.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Cave. I'm Chief Safety Officer at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. In terms of long COVID, I don't have many touch points, but prior to joining MHRA, I was a project director for the UK COVID-19 Therapeutics Advisory Panel, which actually advised on drugs to enter the UK publicly funded trials during the COVID pandemic across the disease pathway. Thank you.
Thanks there. Next, it's Victoria Thomas.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this afternoon's panel. I'm Victoria Thomas. I'm Head of Public Involvement at NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and I oversaw the patient involvement aspects of the development of our NICE COVID guidance, as I do for all of NICE's guidelines. So I have a personal interest in that. I have experience of long COVID myself, but I'm here particularly today with an interest in experience-based evidence and evidence from, by, and designed by patients. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing this afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks there, Victoria. So I think that's all for the panel there. Before we move to questions, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on why we did this event. So that what's the motivation for doing this event, and what kinds of questions we're trying to get under the skin of. So what we wanted to do now is to see where are we with clinics and research. We're into the 4th year. People have had COVID, long COVID, for 3+ years now, and yet we still can't get any licensed treatment. So those of us who are patient experts and are involved in research, we live in a sort of parallel universe where every day we're reading another abstract. As Fiona Glenn showed, there's been an explosion of research. So we're reading all about this. We're reading about potential mechanisms, about biomarkers, about potential therapeutics and so on. But when I go to my GP, when I get reinfected, again, as I do, I go to my GP and there is nothing. Absolutely nothing. So there's that disconnect. On the one hand, I'm seeing all this research, and on the other hand, I can't get access to anything as a result of it. So that's the kind of difficulty that we're trying to understand here. Why is that? And is there anything that we can do about it? Is there anything as patient advocates we can do to try and change things? Where can we put our energy, and where is it kind of just not worth it? Really is what we're trying to understand here. So on that, my opening question relates to the NIHR. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone from the NIHR here today, although we did ask. The NIHR started off very well. They put funding into post-hospital studies. There were 2 commission calls, as Fiona showed in her talk. But that was over 2 years ago now. And really, as we see it, funding has dried up, or a concerted effort to address this problem with funding has dried up. is the NIHR and the other public funders of UKRI, are they a lost cause? Should we just not bother trying to get more public funding for research? Should patient groups just try and raise the money privately ourselves? And I think I'd like to direct that to Brendan to begin with.
Thought you might. It's a really challenging issue. And I think I'll try and base what I'm saying on the experience that I had going to an NIHR meeting, which was organised about 3 months ago now, where those two tranches of funded studies were got together. And I think there was a big gap between where the studies were and where the NIHR thought the meeting was about. So the meeting was set up as a sort of close to end of study sharing of findings, with a strong message: thanks everybody, it's now business as usual. Go back and put proposals in through whichever NIHR stream feels appropriate. And what the audience was saying, both the few patient co-investigators that were there, because it wasn't a very COVID secure event to say the least, was that we've really been struggling with these studies. The whole research system recovering post-COVID in the UK is incredibly sludged up. It's been inordinately difficult and time consuming to get clinics up and running, RCTs approved for drugs, data pulled together. We're just starting to get to grips with the problem, and we're running out of time. Our researchers are being put under notice because they've got less than 6 months contract left. We're not ready yet as a research grouping across all the studies. And I think we're all feeling inadequate as a basis of that, but actually the whole room was in the same situation. We're not ready yet to go back into business as usual. We don't have enough results yet. We can see that we may get something in the next 2 or 3 months. We're putting together the stuff. Ami's study is not going to be finished until March next year on the RCT. How are we going to be filling that gap of funding and maintaining the impetus that we've got when you've got a year's cycle through to the next programme round? There's a yawning gap. And I think everybody shook their heads and came away with, this isn't going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It's too high risk. Yeah, we have to be looking at continuity with other things. Fundamentally, what the NIHR chooses to put money in as a special case is a societal and political decision. It's not an evidence-based, it's not a science-based, it's purely, is there enough outcry and impetus to do that? And I think with the current messaging going around about COVID, that it's over, that is not happening. And I think it's massively to the detriment of research going forward. We will absolutely lose momentum. People who are involved in the area will go off elsewhere. People who are working on projects will go and do different things, and we will be more or less back to square one. It's, I think, quite depressing. The message from that is, I think you have to do what the major charities in any other long-term condition. You have to build a charitable basis for funding. You have to talk to private philanthropy, and you have to plug that gap. And some of that needs to be put into lobbying, but long-term, because it's not going to happen quickly.
Thanks for that, Brendan. Do any of the other speakers have anything to say there? Ray?
I agree with everything Brendan said. I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I think the public health messaging around what's happening with COVID at the moment is incorrect. There's a lot of misinformation out there. The WHO have very, very clearly said in April that if we keep up with this rate of reinfections, we will have hundreds of millions of people disabled and unable to function. Now that has got, already we're seeing huge economic problems as a result of that. The health, the Health Monitoring Board at the World Health Economic Forum has estimated COVID has cost the global economy between COVID and long COVID $21 trillion. David Cutler from Harvard, the economics professor, has done an economic modelling for the US. It's costing the US economy $3.7 trillion. I've spoken to health economists in the UK to get some basic economic modelling done, which is a very conservative estimate, and Luke Vale's team have done that for me, at around 61 million per annum, and that's just a very conservative estimate for long COVID. That's not including all the other post-COVID complications, and there's a truckload of them coming down the highway towards us, and we're doing nothing to prevent it. And as Ami Banerjee quite clearly said yesterday, already, and I've been advocating this for about 18 months, already we have seen 100,000 excess cardiovascular deaths since the start of the pandemic. And I suspect the majority of those will be the thrombotic ones and the inflammatory ones. I don't think we've even touched on the endothelial damage turning into atherosclerosis and premature coronary artery disease yet, because we haven't had enough time. So this is going to be ongoing for decades to come. And and we also have lots of information very clearly showing that the more times you get reinfected with this virus, the worse your health outcomes are. You've got an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, you've got an increased risk of neurovascular disease, you've got an increased risk of diabetes. All of these are lifelong, life-altering illnesses if you survive them, in addition to long COVID, and you've got a cumulative increased risk of long COVID. And if you look at the data, you know, that's after 3 infections, you know, your hazard ratio is up 8 times. So it's incredibly short-sighted not to be trying to look for a treatment, a cure, whilst also trying to mitigate and prevent and putting in sensible prevention like clean air, because this is going to have repercussions globally, not just for us, but for our kids' generation and for decades to come. And so really what we need in the UK and everywhere, it's the same in the States, it's the same in other countries. I've got colleagues, obviously, I'm working with to the World Health Network in Australia, South Africa. It's the same everywhere, but really what we need is we need what we had with acute COVID. We need this to be prioritised. We need it to be fast-tracked. We need the MHRA to be supported and resourced. We need our CTUs to be supported and resourced, because I know they've got some issues with staffing levels as well. So it's not just about the funding, it's about the funding and the prioritisation of the studies and getting them put through quickly, but also to make it cost effective and cost efficient. What we probably need is a UK task force, maybe led through the UKRI, to sit down collectively, all of us together, and say, look, this is what the biomechanistic studies have shown. We know there's endothelitis, we know there's POX, we know there's dysautonomia, we know it's causing brain damage, we know there's an increased risk of Parkinson's disease, we know there may be early onset dementia, we know it's causing this, we know it might be causing that, we know it's doing this. Here are the therapeutic targets along the pathophysiological pathways that we could intervene in. And it's a very complex multi-system disease. We have different subtypes, we have different subgroups, we need to be able to characterize them better. But also because a lot of these patients will have more than one pathway triggered, post-response pathway triggered at the same time, it may be that it's going to take combined therapeutics to try and treat people and get them back to work. And until we get the funding to do the trials, we're stuck. And so really we do need to be investing in this. And whether that comes through private enterprise, whether it comes through donations, whether it comes through crowdfunding, whether it comes through government, ideally we want to see it coming through government. But if it's not forthcoming, a mixture of them would be fine. But we need to do it, but we don't want any duplication of studies. And it's really important that this precious money is spent on the right trials as well. We've done enough surveys now. We've done enough, and they were really important because we needed to know what we were dealing with, but we've done enough of those now. We've done a lot of biomechanistic studies now. What we really need to be focusing on is building on the excellent research we've already got, which is showing us the pathophysiological changes and targeting them with drug therapeutics and testing these in RCTs. And that's where
Ray, can I interrupt? Because you've said a lot of things and I want to pick up on. You mentioned the MHRA, and from our point of view as patients, the MHRA processes are opaque. I know that the MHRA is a signatory to the shared commitment to involvement, which was spearheaded by the HRA last year. So I know that patient involvement does happen, but I am not aware of any patient involvement happening in the MHRA around long COVID specifically. So could I ask, Alison, when the decisions are made at the MHRA, are patients in the room?
So it's probably just useful to reflect back on our processes at MHRA. So obviously we don't stimulate research, we don't fund research directly. So in order for us to assess an application, we need one submitted to us by either a manufacturer, marketing authorization holder, or academic group, but usually a marketing authorization holder. So that is the first step which we require. And to date, there has been none. So, you know, reflecting back on listening to colleagues online, it reminds me very much of the situation in a way where we were in the pandemic. And I think there's a few learnings from the pandemic which we need to bring into the long COVID space. So early on in the pandemic, when we were looking at drugs to repurpose into trials, we had huge problems because we didn't understand the disease progression. We didn't understand treatment pathways. And as everyone is aware, those changed through the early stages of the pandemic. We had to think about which drugs we needed for which part of the disease pathway. So obviously, if you want a drug for a prophylactic treatment, then it can't be an IV drug. It needs to be a drug that can be easily and safely implemented in that sort of healthcare setting. And we also, you know, and here we probably do as well, we needed medicines where, for the pandemic, where we understood the benefit risk profile of that medicine. And they were generally medicines that were repurposed from other indications. So they were used for other treatments and they were used in the pandemic. And that's where we got dexamethasone from for the treatment of COVID itself. We understood the benefit risk profile. We understand the benefits and we understand the risks of treatments. If we are to get quick treatments in for long COVID, then we probably do need to be looking at repurposed medicines, as we would say, medicines that are being used for other indications currently, where we understand what are the benefits and what are the harms, and then we can bring them in to the trials for long COVID. But we do need trials in order to really be confident that we're giving benefit to patients, because if a treatment is used that's not giving benefit, that's a lost opportunity for that patient. So we really need to be confident that the treatments that are indicated are actually bringing benefit. And for those, we do need generally randomized controlled trials, big pragmatic trials like we had in recovery, where we can bring large numbers of patients in, simple endpoints which are easy to capture, potentially in an electronic health record. Those sort of trials will enable us to really understand whether treatments worked or not. It's a very complex disease, long COVID, where as far as I'm aware, there's not very clear diagnostic criteria of whether a patient is deriving benefit or not. And those are some of the challenges, I think, in the research space currently. Very similar to during the pandemic itself.
Yeah, can I bring in Nikki? You had your hand up there.
Yeah, from the patient's point of view, how damn frustrating. We're into our 4th year now of long COVID, a lot of us who are ill in the first wave. There's been a lot of knowledge around for years now about post-viral conditions. None of this is a surprise as to what's happening with long COVID. We should have been ready for this. I've been working for a while with Brendan and also Joseph that spoke earlier, doing research on the pathophysiology of long COVID. And we're looking at papers from 21, 22, all pointing to the same things. And it's easy to draw out from that potential treatments. It's astonishing that the funding isn't there for those treatments to be trialed because the knowledge has been there for years, these things need to be expedited. You've got millions of people suffering from long COVID. We've seen the research, we've seen the figures. There's no excuse. It's crazy that this isn't being done.
Helen, can I give you, I've completely dominated, so over to you.
Let me in. No, I want to link those themes actually, and probably a question to Alison, maybe some of the clinicians, and then to Nikki, which is, well, what happens now? What happens to people, as Nikki said, the many hundreds of thousands, millions of people that are living with long COVID that don't have the solution to help them? How do we make that happen? And I'd like to ask maybe Alison, in the first instance, to reflect on two things. You mentioned about you're not getting submissions from market authorization holders, but we do need to move to repurpose medication. So a reflection on the mechanism for doing that. But I think the main part of the question is, well, what do patients do? Are they're accessing non-evidence-based treatments now? And those could be of significant concern and significant safety concern. You know, getting insight from that through, say, your yellow card scheme, we know that's quite challenging in terms of people's knowledge of the scheme and how long it takes to report and all the rest of it. So what is it that we can do to advise people, you know, what they can do and what they really oughtn't to do from their own personal safety of these non-evidence-based treatments? So maybe start with you, Alison, maybe some of the clinicians, and then back to Nikki on that.
Well, unfortunately, much of that lies in the domain of clinical care and would point to NICE guidelines in terms of clinical guidance, which obviously falls outside the remit of the MHRA. From our perspective, you know, obviously we're looking at randomized trials to look at treatments which may provide benefit, but also then to actually carefully monitor safety. We do have a number of trials ongoing. And there's been a number of observational trials as well, but they're generally tracking symptoms and trying to better understand disease progression rather than actually trialing treatments. We do need to understand which treatments work and which don't, because, you know, as you know, even during the recovery trial, we tried, you know, during the COVID pandemic, we tried a number of treatments we thought would work, and they didn't all. So it is really important that patients do talk to their healthcare professional. They don't try treatments they hope will work that don't have that evidence, but really go and talk to their healthcare professional, because it is very hard to navigate this space without that true evidence of benefit. So really, my advice would be, I know it's frustrating, but not to self-medicate, to talk to your healthcare professional and get proper evidence, because no medicine is without harm, Helen, as you know yourself. And it could be that you will derive no benefit, but potentially suffer a side effect, which is not helpful.
Yeah, could I just come in there and say that actually there's a massive amount of knowledge within the long COVID community, and lots of us are trying things because the risk to us of not trying things is large. We're looking at losing our jobs, losing our homes, young people moving back in with their parents. And we are, a lot of doctors and scientists with long COVID, we are not naive. We are not stupid. We are capable of reading the literature and making an informed decision. Okay, there isn't an RCT on this, but the safety profile is decent. It might work. I'm going to give it a try. I try things myself, right? And on that basis, I think it's somewhat patronizing to the people that are in this room and the people who have a massive amount of knowledge accrued over these last 3 years, for the kind of regulatory authorities to say, no, we're in charge now, and you just have to sit back and put up with what we're saying. So, and I want to bring in Binita here as well, because I know that she'll have a lot to say about treatments.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, for making that point. I want to bring this back to kind of the individual patient and doctor. So as a clinician, when we get back to absolute basics, what is our role? Our role is to look at the person in front of us, try and understand what's going on for that person, and treat. And if we can't cure, we help them by treating their symptoms. Now, we know that we've heard a lot about how long COVID is complex. But within that complexity, when you start seeing enough patients, you see very, very clear patterns of disease, very clear patterns of illness. And I can put, just from my own clinical experience, can put patients into these buckets now where I think, well, this is more histamine driven, this is more vascular driven. And you can then use basic physiology and understanding of the pathophysiology to repurpose drugs to treat. You have a risk benefits discussion with the patient, and you do that shared decision making, and you do a trial of treatment. Now, why we can't do that on a large scale, especially when we've got the number of patients that we have that have been through long COVID clinics, I don't understand. And I think it's partly the lack of will and initiative nationally to do that. It's a lack of a registry. It's a lack of coordinated research effort. And it's incredibly frustrating for those of us who do treat patients and see that they can improve with certain treatments, that not everybody has access to those. And I think the second thing is it's not that there aren't treatments, it's that there's a lack of confidence in using treatments because people don't understand long COVID, because we don't have the education and the research is not being translated into frontline clinical practice. We've kind of got this idea that it's RCTs or nothing. And as Margaret has pointed out, there's this huge, 3 years of evidence from clinicians treating, from patients treating themselves, that we could use to inform our decisions and come up with consensus guidelines. I have got a lot to say, but I'll let others come in. There's a few hands up.
So Nikki, and then Brendan. And then Ray. And then
yes. Go Margaret. Yes, everything you said, it exceeds me frustrated. Are you expecting patients just to sit back year after year and wait for everyone else to catch up? There's information out there, even basic stuff for primary care. Locomotion study, we did several BMJ practice pointers for GPs, including an overall one on long COVID, one on orthostatic tachycardia, one on breathing difficulties. We've got one coming out on cognitive dysfunction, one on vocational rehab. I still get my GP surgery contacting me and saying, what's the latest on research? What do you recommend I tell patients? It's terrible. One of the conditions we know is quite prevalent in people with long COVID is dysautonomia and POTS. As soon as I was put on a beta blocker, which had to be prescribed off license because there is no approved treatment for POTS, it helped my tachycardia, it stopped my migraines, and it stopped that horrific on-edge feeling that so many people with long COVID get. Something as simple as that could be given early on to people experiencing the symptoms of POTS can make an astounding difference to the quality of their life and help them just get on and potentially get back to work to some extent. We can't keep waiting for things to be approved for us to try them.
Thanks, Nikki. Brendan?
Yeah, I have a bit of a history of pushing within this area for treatment of symptoms in that grey area where there's a drug with a good safety profile that may possibly treat a set of symptoms or downstream treatable traits, things like POTS, the antihistamine things, and trying to encourage clinicians to do that. So just after the first NICE guideline, I was involved with a group of doctors with long COVID via a social media group, and we've been talking a lot and exchanging ideas around therapies. And I looked at the guideline and I thought, oh my goodness, it doesn't say anything at all, because there's no literature. The whole system has failed there. We need to get some information out there, some guidance and things. So we put together a Delphi process of some ideas and guidance, which was eventually published about 5 months later in the British Journal of General Practice. But the first journal I sent it to came back and said, who are you to produce a consensus statement? You're not the right kind of people. So I replied to the editor, well, who would you think were the right kind of people? I said, well, you know, presidents of royal colleges and that kind of thing. To which I replied, well, what do they know about long COVID? So you have this real tension between, if you like, the establishment, which generally is there to protect patients from outlying practice and stuff. It's not shoot it, but it can act as a block for things. And it needs to be replaced by a sense of urgency to push the limits on what's safe and helpful. And I think the articles that Nikki has mentioned, particularly the BMJ practice pointers, have been really helpful in that point. And Trish Green has been an absolute star in negotiating with the BMJ what we're allowed to say. She's very good at finessing the words on that. But there's a chunk of other stuff which may well be appropriate, but these are hefty drugs which are not used in primary care. They're not generally used outside the conditions, immunosuppressants, immunomodulators, all that kind of thing, which probably would be very useful given some of the signs from things. They really need trials, and they need fast-track trials. And they need to be put in as a sense of urgency, like the acute COVID work was. There is no sense of urgency in any condition at the moment. Now, you can argue, why should long COVID be special? I think everything you've heard about the impact says that it should be special. Absolutely.
And can I thank you, Brendan. And that sense of urgency, Ray, you mentioned about the task force, about your thinking about the combination of all these factors, of researchers, experience, people with lived experience, the frontline practitioners that are gaining insight and trying to coordinate this. Because it seems to me that the models of the kind of structured models that Trish was outlining and said it's not working in this kind of set of conditions, the kind of the old ways of the regulatory frameworks don't seem to be fit for purpose with this very, very complex condition. So please comment on whatever you'd like to comment on, but I'd love to hear more about your idea of this kind of coalescence of task force.
I think it's on two levels, really. One is a task force predominantly to sort out the research between clinicians and the researchers and patients with lived experience, who are obviously the very important third spoke in that wheel, about how we go about doing this and which drugs we can already use. So, for example, treating POTS. Treating POTS has been around for decades and decades. There's no reason we cannot treat POTS. And I'm going to come on to that again a little bit later. But I pretty much agree with everything Brendan says, but I agree with Brendan again, that there are certain drugs that actually, of course, we do need to test them in an RCT, but we are very conscious that patients have been waiting far too long already for treatment, and we need to get these RCTs done, but we need the funding to do them, and we need to get them done effectively and efficiently, and what we don't want is duplication between different research groups. So it'd be great if we could all sit down and say, right, you do that, you do that, you do that, this is how much it's going to cost, this is how quickly we think we can do it, these are how many patients we need. And we've got this amazing resource in England, maybe not so much in Wales and Scotland because they haven't got the long COVID clinics, where really we should be trying to integrate all of this research into long COVID care as well, so that we can get all of this done. So that's the first point, just from a research perspective. From a how do we tackle long COVID full stop, to do that, I don't know if you want me to talk about this now or is that a question for the end, but to do that, I think really we need to have it's going to take a huge paradigm shift in our thinking around post-viral illness. And I don't just mean long COVID, ME/CSF need to not be forgotten about as well, because they have suffered for decades. So really what we need to be doing is a multi-pronged approach. And ideally, it would be very good if we could have an expert task force in the UK for that approach as well, that was ideally independent of government, because we want it to be following the science and not being distracted by any other agendas. And that sort of thing would be good public health messaging. How do we reduce the reinfection rate? What do we need to do to stop people catching this? What do we need to do to prevent long COVID? What do we need to do to research long COVID? What do we need to do to treat people when they've been infected to stop them getting long COVID? And what do we need to do to help the patients that have already got long COVID? And to do that, what we need is in fact, the WHO even covered this as well. They have sent out a big article in The Guardian some months ago from Tedros, very clearly saying governments need to sit down with long COVID researchers and long COVID physicians and patients and listen to them. And what ideally, I think we need a cross-party parliamentary group that has a budget, that sits down with aerosol engineers, that sits down with, you know, the Department of Education, talks about how we make schools safe, sits down with representatives of NHS England, talks about, you know, I know a lot of patients are very concerned about going to hospitals now that we've dropped mask mandates, and quite rightly so, because a lot of these patients are immunocompromised, and if they catch COVID, their outcomes will be worse. How do we keep them safe? How do we reduce the reinfection rate? What drugs do we need to trial? How quickly can we do them? What drugs is it safe for us to give already based on the information we've got? How do we integrate that into our long COVID clinics? How can we make care across the long COVID clinics equitable? Some of them are physician-led, some of them aren't physician-led. I would argue that all the long COVID clinics need to be physician-led, because we need to be able to treat things like, if there's one thing we could do right now, the one thing I think that would make a very big difference to long COVID care in the UK is to investigate and treat dysautonomia properly. I don't know if you've seen the publication that's just come out. There's been a publication literally published this week looking at a cohort of individuals showing that dysautonomia is occurring in up to 79% of people with long COVID. And it's so easy to diagnose. I mean, I do it in every single patient in my clinic. It's not difficult. You know, we bring them in, we do an acetylene test or an active stand test. You know, I try and coordinate it to see whether they've got endothelial damage as well, which again, these tests are available in the NHS. You know, then we do a take to make sure to see, have they got IST? Have they got, you know, there's certain drugs you wouldn't get, you know, if Aberdeen you wouldn't give if they had arrhythmias, for example. But again, it's really not difficult once you know what you're doing. It needs a bit of training, but it's not difficult. But again, some of those drugs, obviously they do still need to be monitored by doctors, because there's certain people that can't have them, certain people that would do better. There's a range of maybe about, you know, 7 or 8, well, at least 5 or 6 drugs that you could use for dysautonomia that you'd use in different settings. And you just need to have a little bit of knowledge about how you do that. So that was it. That was the other thing. So that's something that we could easily do. We could easily do that. We need to wait another 3 years in an RCT. Dysautonomia and POTS and treatment for that has been around for decades.
Right, so, sorry, can I come in there? Because I want to, I'm conscious we've got Alison and Victoria here, and I want to really, and although, you know, obviously you don't do research, the NICE and MHRA don't fund research. However, NICE does signal what research is needed. It does signal what research gaps are, and the MHRA does interact with pharmaceutical companies and other organisations which are developing the research. And I think what we're hearing here, we need, there's a sense of urgency. So I think we're hearing the phrase business as usual from the NHR, from NHS England. Now, as far as we're concerned, I would love business as usual. I would love it if I went to my doctor and there was a clear pathway, and I went to a clinic and it was full of doctors giving me evidence-based drugs. That would be great. But we don't have business as usual because it's a new human disease. And our argument is, one, the impact is massive. We've got 2 million people. We've seen from Joseph Kwan this morning, and Jenny and Alice, the TUC report is devastating people's lives, and it's affecting the economy and so on. So it's a massive problem. So that's one thing. And then it's a new human disease. So you cannot, and Alison, you described really well the rate of change with the recovery trial and with acute COVID. Now, we understand we can't have that kind of urgency, and people dying is the biggest urgency of all. However, it's 4 years. So really, we think there should be, it's not like this warp speed and then nothing, but that's what it feels like. It feels like, you know, it's either this big emergency, but for the rest of us, or we're just back into the general pool of put in your application, try and get a wee bit of funding. And there just doesn't seem to be urgency or talking between agencies to say, look, this is a problem, how do we deal with this? And with the MHRA, in its conversations with, say, Pfizer or whoever is bringing out a new monoclonal antibody treatment, we see these through the stakeholder involvement at NICE. We've been involved in this. So you've got this drug, they've done a trial, they looked at death and hospitalization, that's it. Death and hospitalization. They didn't even look at long COVID. So we would like NICE and MHRA to use their influence to say, well, long COVID is COVID. So if you're coming to us with a COVID treatment, you've got to look at long COVID as a bare minimum. it's not enough just to do death and hospitalisation as outcomes. You have got to look at other outcomes, and we're going to push you on that. And that's what we would like as patients. We would like NICE and MHRA, you exist for patients. You exist for the people who have the illnesses. Where is our voice, and where can we bring our voice to bear in the work that you do to try and address our issues? Could I ask Victoria about that to start with, and then Alison?
Well, there's my professional position, and then there's my personal position. And my personal position is that actually this feels to me like a situation where, a very familiar situation where we have reached a crisis point because we have not listened to patients. It's the Bristol baby heart scandal, it's mesh, it's the breast implants, it's, you know, it's the poor performance in maternity services. It's the areas of care where the patients are the canary. They're telling us there's something seriously wrong and that something seriously needs to change, and the systems aren't reacting to that, and so they react to a crisis. And it sounds from what everyone has described that that crisis is here, but it's not being acknowledged as it should be. So I think there's something, there's a kind of broader philosophical lesson about listening to what patients are saying more fundamentally, because actually that's where you're going to get your real insight. And that there's also something about, and I caught the end of Trish and Fiona's conversation. There's something about the willingness to live with uncertainty that's really challenging to organisations like mine, and I would imagine to Alison's as well. That actually that there are obligations around ensuring that people are safe are so predominant that actually we are more risk averse than the patients are. And I know from talking to patients who've given testimony at the FDA that when treatments have been withdrawn, that for safety reasons, that they're saying, you've taken away the only thing that works for me. Actually, I understand your position of paternalism, but actually for me, I'm prepared to take the risk. So there's something there about whose risk we are looking at and how we try and include that in trial designs. And I guess my question, and not just RCT trial designs, but all the kind of, I mean, the fact that there is no registry data just seems crazy to me. I don't understand why we're not collecting kind of population level data, because there's so much of it. I guess going back to Brendan's point earlier is because this is highly political, and because it, you know, it isn't always science-led, personal fact. But so for me, there are two things. There's one, which is a whole program of work that's being led out of Liverpool University, which is around the development of core outcomes. And this goes back to your specific point, Margaret, about if you are doing a trial in this area, then long COVID should always be one of the outcomes that you look at. And there's something about standardizing the outcomes that we're expecting from trials. And that's something that I think that we as an assessment body can signal to the system to say, we are expecting to see this data when we look at your trial. So there's something about the signals that we send back out into the system about what we expect to see in terms of the outcomes that trialists have looked at. And going back to your very first point, Margaret, which was about the public funding of research in this domain. Where's the appetite from the pharmaceutical industry? There seems to be very little, actually, and I think that's a real issue. And I wonder whether there's something there about messages to our pharma stakeholders about the fact that although we make these research recommendations where we spot the gaps as NICE, they are directed to the MRC and the NIHR. Do we need to be directing them towards the pharma industry as well? So that's kind of more of a rhetorical question, but I think that the fundamental thing is that we are not using experience-based evidence from patients and their carers to determine best practice, I would say.
And Alison, could you come in on that point about signals to pharmaceutical companies? Is that something MHRA does?
So yeah, just a couple of points. So firstly, reflecting back, Margaret, at my previous comments, which you felt was patronising, and just wanted to say it was not intended to be that way at all. I was reflecting back on my experience through the COVID-19 pandemic, where we did masses of research to try and understand which treatments might be most beneficial. And despite that, many of those treatments did not work through the recovery trial. And I was just reflecting back that it is, and as Chief Safety Officer, you know, my remit is to keep patients safe. And it's just very, very important that we remember that all treatments can potentially have harm as well as benefits, and that it is very important to reflect back on that. That was that despite thinking that treatments would work during COVID-19, they didn't always. And that was just my point there. I mean, just listening to this conversation, it's an incredibly challenging situation. To be clear, MHRA interacts through regulated forum with manufacturers. It's not our role to promote particular areas of research or to call out for applications to come in. However, we do have routes where manufacturers can come and talk to us about their development profiles. We would really welcome that. We have the options for scientific advice meetings. We also have new innovative pathways, such as an innovative licensing access pathway, where we encourage manufacturers to come and talk to us early, to talk about their development profile, and so that we can walk with them through that to try and bring medicines to patients as early as possible. And that's really, really key. And I would just say, you know, I'm looking at the trials that are currently in. We have only very few trials on long COVID currently on our books. They all have different outcome measures. They all have different designs. And I think, again, reflecting back to COVID, where we had hundreds and hundreds of small trials with inconsistent designs and inconsistent outcome measures, which didn't lead to any benefit, that we really do need to think as a community, what are the best trial designs in this space? What do patients need? And very much patients are at the heart of everything we do. As Chief Safety Officer, that's my predominant concern. We do want to listen to patients, what matters to patients. So I think that a registry in this space would be enormously helpful. It would provide a way to track disease progression, to understand different outcome measures, to be able to understand treatments that may be working in some individuals and not in others, but also to provide a platform for trial recruitment where companies and academics could go to recruit patients for trials and then track their outcomes. So I do think that that would be a big step forward if something like that could be established.
And just briefly, you mentioned about listening to patients and patients being at the heart. What are the mechanisms, you know, when you're having these conversations with other companies? Are patients in the room?
So patients for the ILAP that I talked about, there are patients on that pathway. We have a patient consultative forum where we engage with patients on almost all of our committees. There are patients and lay representatives. And certainly in my space, which is safety, we regularly have patient listening sessions. We're involving patients in all our benefit and risk assessments. So we have a whole patient engagement strategy, which you can read about on our website, but definitely, yes, thank you.
So we could be, if perhaps we can contact you for information about how to get involved in that. Thanks. Ray, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a couple of three really brief points. One was to say, I totally agree with Alison about a registry task force. I think that's the way we have to do it so that the outcomes are the same and everybody's on the same page. A registry of new patients with long COVID is going to be very difficult as we've shut down our ONS surveillance and we've told people COVID's over and people are not testing and not isolating anymore. So that's a problem because we need to know people are, we can always diagnose people from the symptoms, but it's easier if we know they've had COVID, and it's easier for us to diagnose COVID. The other thing I wanted to come on to is what Victoria had said, again, which I agree with, about treatments and where we're up to. And as doctors, one of the first things we're taught is at first do no harm. But at first do no harm does not mean at first do nothing, because to do nothing is doing immeasurable harm. And we're already seeing that because we have an excess death rate in this country now of 1,000 patients per week. We have an excess death rate in England alone, cardiovascular death rate of 500 patients per week. Now, some of that may be due to NHS backlog, but a significant proportion of that is going to be due to COVID-related cardiovascular disease. And we know that because there's now been multiple trials across multiple continents involving millions of patients, all of them showing the same thing, that there's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease after COVID, and that there's a 10-fold increased risk of death for 18 months after COVID infection. So long COVID is the canaries in the coal mine. This is not just long COVID, this is anybody that's been infected. And at the moment, we are doing nothing, and that's not acceptable any longer. We now know this data is there. So the other thing I think we need to be doing is we need to be risk stratifying patients to see whether they're at risk of cardiovascular disease. And we know it's causing endothelial damage. So why aren't we testing for this routinely? We risk stratify patients with other traditional risk factors for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension, smoking. All of those cause endothelial damage. And we treat those with a high risk by giving them a statin and an aspirin. So why are we not doing this for COVID and working out what role COVID's having in this? There's enough information out there, but we need to start doing something, because at first do no harm does not mean at first do nothing. And the last point I just wanted to make, which might be some good news, we're talking about the desperate need for guidelines. So we at the World Health Network, on the Long COVID Expert Advisory Team, we have put together an international task force from multiple countries around the world, and we're writing a Delphi for some guidelines that we think are a working guideline in practice that we can do now based on all of the research that we have on long COVID at the moment, and expert consensus opinion across multiple continents. That should be out. It's going to take a while to get finished, but that should be out soon, and it will just give some basic information on easy tests that we can do, easy low-risk treatments that have got an evidence base behind them that can be given, like treating dysautonomia, etc. And then we will have a section on that about treatments that may be useful going forward, but that absolutely need to be tested in RCTs beforehand. So that's where we're up to at the WHN.
Thanks, Ray. That's really great to hear. I mean, we're coming to the end, and our final question we wanted to put to everybody was the topic of the webinar: what needs to happen next? And I know that you could probably all write an essay on this, but could you just think of one thing that you think needs to happen next? And I think I'm going to start with Binita on this one.
For me, it's about education of healthcare professionals and translating what the science is telling us into practical things we can do with patients.
And on that, Binita has a YouTube channel called Long COVID Clinic, What You Can Do, which is on YouTube at the moment, and we can send information about that. Or if anybody knows the Twitter handle, you can put it in the chat for me. Okay, next, can I go to Brendan?
Thanks. I'll try not to duplicate what I think other people might say. So I'll put something. I think we've been trying to, I mean, Nikki and I and Joseph and a couple of other people on Locomotion, we've been trying to put together a putative causal network map around all the studies that have been done on associating mechanisms with symptoms. And you can put that together, and it's quite complex. I think the message from that is you can't expect simple single treatment solutions to have large effects in this condition. It's multi-layered in that there are knock-on physiological effects. We've seen POTS as one of them. What's underlying that? What's caused the endothelial infection? So there's a cascade of stuff going on, and how far upstream do you have to do before another pathway takes over and you get no effect? And secondly, and I'm aware of no research in this area, there must be longer term changes happening to patients as a result of having long COVID for a long period of time. What permanent damage is done, what is reversible, and what secondary consequences are arising later on. We're still seeing a really strong signal, as Ray said, on the cardiovascular side of things. That is not surprising. but I'm sure there are other things going on as well. We really need to establish those longitudinal cohorts and start thinking about where in this pathway can we intervene with what treatments.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Ray, can I come to you?
Yeah, so I think we need to start designing our trials and our treatments to treat the underlying pathophysiology and not just addressing symptoms, because that will reduce a multitude of symptoms. So treat the underlying pathophysiology. But the second huge big thing is we have to mitigate against people getting reinfected, because there's nothing more heartbreaking than struggling with patients for a year, getting them well enough to go back to work, they go back into an unmitigated workplace, and they catch it again, and they're back to square one and they're bedbound. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, you're talking about me. So yeah, I completely endorse that one. Could I ask Victoria, and then Alison, and then Nikki?
So I think that, and again, I'm taking my professional hat off here, I think there's something about how we can reinvigorate the public health messages, because the narrative is so strong that COVID is over and it wasn't that big a deal anyway, it's just a bit of flu. And that's just become so prevalent, and the excess death statistics that Ray was talking about earlier are so shocking, and I don't think anybody knows about them in the general public. So there's something about awareness raising that I think that really, really needs to happen. And I don't, you know, those people who've got those good relationships with the health journalists or whatever it is, I think that's what's needed, is a huge public health kind of awareness raising effort that this has not gone away. And in fact, the long-term sequelae of what people have experienced will continue, as Ray has already said, generationally. So this is something that needs a much higher profile, I think, than it currently has.
Thanks, Victoria. Alison?
Yeah, so it's been a very interesting panel. I mean, probably my take-home message is not one size is going to fit all here. It's going to probably be very personalized treatment options, probably combined treatment options, so not a single therapy, very complex trials. So it does feel like we must learn the lessons of COVID and come together to design trials with good diagnostic tests, good outcome measures which matter to patients. So those outcome measures which affect the lives of patients with long COVID must be in those trials, but also to very much think about Ray's point there, we need to start looking at disease modifying agents rather than just simply treating the symptoms, and so trials have to be designed in that approach. So, you know, come and talk to us, come and talk to our trial clinicians, and yeah, very happy to have those discussions.
Thanks, Alison. Nikki?
Thanks, Margaret. I've never before been so ill that I really thought I was going to die until I got long COVID. The facts and figures are out there. For example, the REACT studies shown 69% of people with symptoms at 12 weeks are still symptomatic at 1 year. And as mentioned earlier by Joseph today, a recent paper by Walker et al. On their study of nearly 4,000 people with long COVID showed that functional impairment was worse than in patients who had a stroke and comparable to patients with Parkinson's disease. And health-related quality of life was worse than patients with some advanced cancers. In this country, we have some of the best researchers in the world who could, to quote Mark Watney, science the crap out of long COVID, given appropriate funding to do so. Given the number of people impacted by this illness and the knock-on effects on the health service, education, the workforce, the economy, it's utterly astounding that long COVID research is not prioritised. We know there's a volcano of COVID-related illnesses that is exploding, and research with the patient voice at the centre needs to sprint to not only catch up to it, but to try and stem that flow. So thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Helen, and thanks to everyone who's been involved in arranging this brilliant webinar.
Thanks, Nikki. I echo that as well. Thank you to all the panel members, and for Helen stepping in at short notice. Also, North Thames Clinical Research Network. I think Amar probably needs a week off and a spa retreat by now. They've been absolutely brilliant, and they've part funded the event with the platform. Eureka Health also sponsored speaker fees for patients as well, and we thank them too. And Long COVID Scotland, who also co-organised. I think we will sum this up. We have a writing team as we speak who are going to produce a summary of this event, which we'll make sure that we get to everybody. And as I said at the beginning, the point of this was for us to focus our energies on what to do in the future. So I think there will be further follow-up conversations to be had with everybody. And the sense I'm getting is that everybody would be happy to have those. But it's been a busy 2 days. And I think those of us, especially those who are in sympathetic overdrive and have high heart rates by now, need to go and have a lie down. But Amar, do you want to do final closing remarks?
Thank you, Margaret. I think you've summarized it really well, actually. I don't think there's much more to add apart from just thank you so much for everyone who spoke to Long COVID Support, Long COVID Scotland. I think it's really opened my eyes to what, how everyone's feeling and what needs to be done. And so really grateful that I was given the opportunity to help organize the event as well. So thank you very much, and hope everyone has a good rest afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zane, the CEO and co-founder of Eureka Health. Eureka is a website for patients to share their experiences trying different treatments to help everyone learn what's working and what's not. Our goal is to enable you, whether you're a patient, a clinician, a researcher, to find treatments that are most likely to work for specific types of long COVID. Now, we all appreciate the need for more research into more treatments, but clinical trials can be slow and expensive. Meanwhile, patients are often left navigating one-off anecdotes in online patient communities like Reddit or Facebook. And so that's where there's a significant data gap and where Eureka steps in. My personal connection to this is my mom. She was diagnosed with a chronic neurological condition about 5 years ago. Doctors soon ran out of treatment options, so we found ourselves turning to online patient communities. And although there's no cure, we did find a mix of treatments that helped her manage her symptoms, preserving her quality of life. Eureka is aiming to streamline this process. We collate data from these real-world experiences to offer better, faster insights. And we're not just helping patients. We're also giving researchers and clinicians more immediate data on what treatments are working. Today, we have over 23,000 treatment reports spanning across nearly 250 different treatments. And based on this patient-reported data, we're able to match individuals with treatments most likely to benefit their specific symptoms. So our mission is to bridge that data gap between patient anecdotes and clinical trials, and to foster a stronger link between patients and research. We're amplifying the patient voice and accelerating evidence generation. So if this resonates with you, I invite you to visit us at eurekahealth.com. Together, we can speed up the journey to understanding and managing long COVID, ME/CFS, POTS, and many other chronic diseases. Thanks to Long COVID Support for having us here.